Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
Doing fine. Our program today is going to be a little bit different. We spend a lot of time talking about foreign policy, obviously, and a lot of time on economic policy and big spending and things. But I would put this into the category more of politics, but I can't talk about politics without talking about the big picture as well, you know, about what policy is all about. But I want to go over a little bit and get your opinion, and we'll discuss a little bit about Jeff Flake's well-covered speech yesterday. He had a lot of attention when he gave this speech, which I think was pretty unusual because it wasn't in the Senate chamber, but it was a special conference, and sometimes you can go to your Republican conference or the Democratic conference, but it was bipartisan, all the senators and Republican and Democrats there, and he gives this significant speech that got unbelievable coverage. And the reason I think there was this tremendous coverage is he was speaking for a lot of people, very frustrated and very angry, and that is the Republican establishment, you know, the old line, typical Republicans, and also a Democrat just for partisan reasons. So he had a pretty big audience, you know, and this big coverage. But the whole thing is what did it do, and what was the real reason why he was upset? Was it because he understood where the real problems were? Maybe it's political, maybe it's his ratings in Arizona. Who knows exactly what motivated him, but you know, basically from my viewpoint, he was saying things that weren't outrageous, but the conflict that it seemed to symbolize, I think, is outrageous and has a lot of significance about where we are. In many ways, I think what we're witnessing is the cracking apart and the breaking apart of the empire. And they're not addressing that. They think this is just a personality. It's all Trump's fault, or it's all Schumer's fault, and you know, it's Democrats versus Republicans. So I think they're missing the whole thing. I think there's a bigger story here, and that is we're at an impasse. Washington is at an impasse, and whose fault is it is the question. And I guess the speech yesterday was a suggestion of who should be blamed.
Yeah, and it was a 17-minute speech. Essentially, it was an announcement that he would not be running for re-election next year. He would leave the Senate when his term expired at the beginning of 2019. And of course, you're right, it got a lot of cable coverage. The cable loved it, CNN loved it, but it was because it was very critical of, essentially, of the president. And it shouldn't be a surprise that the mainstream media loved it and amplified it. It wasn't because of the issues, it was because, you know, they've been, I think, what, 92% negative coverage of President Trump. So they love it because it's Trump bashing. It's not because there were some principles or some issues that he brought up that were significant.
Yeah, and I think when we get ourselves into trouble financially and a foreign policy that is failing and nobody wants to admit the fundamental flaws, you know, whether it's the Federal Reserve and all, they have to go, and it becomes partisan. You know, the partisanship is real, but the philosophy is usually not much different. They go along to get along, and they all spend the money. But when there's an impasse and things aren't working well and they can't just add things to the budget and make everybody happy, I think this is a setting for bringing the worst out in people, the worst out in politicians, the worst out in people who are there for power. And it brings out, you know, grating personalities at times. And you could argue the case that this certainly is an accusation and sometimes justly made about the president. You know, he seems to take things on and, you know, is really gruff with people. And also, I think character traits come out too. And sometimes they're subtle and appear to be polite, but they're really not. And they're really at each other's throats, but I think for the wrong reasons. I think they're, right now, when you see this episode, everybody's looking in all the wrong places because I think it's a big issue. I think we're in a similar situation like the Soviet system was in the late 1980s, that something big was happening and hardly anybody knew it. Nobody said, oh, you know, in 1989, in 1990, you know, the Soviet system is going to be gone. Nobody said that. But there's something going on here, and when I see this type of animosity, and then you know, the struggle on taxes and the struggle over socialized medicine and the struggle over the spending, and most likely, you know, they're not going to have any solution. I keep hoping, well, maybe something good would come if they would just release a little bit of freedom for our medical care system, or a little bit of restraint on the Federal Reserve, or a little bit of change in the foreign policy. But it doesn't seem to happen. Everybody is locked in, and I think they're locked in because philosophically they're closer together than they want to admit.
Yeah, and Senator Flake said there are more important things than a political career, and that's a good point.
Yeah.
I think you've discovered that. But you're right. When it comes down to, you know, the speech was about style, and I don't think there's much in there that you disagree with in that respect. But his big complaint was on style, but he didn't talk a lot about policy. He talked about the tone. And I was just looking at an article that said he voted in favor of the Trump position 91.7 times, 91.7%. So in terms of the actual policies, it doesn't seem that opposed. If I may say, where he voted against the Trump position has been in favor of even more hawkishness, believe it or not. He voted on June 14th for Russian sanctions. President Trump didn't want the Senate to vote yes on that. July 27th for North Korea, Russia, and Iran sanctions, some more sanctions. The president didn't want that for whatever reason. And he also, and this is a pretty bad thing, I think, he voted to kill Rand's amendment to sunset the authorization for use of military force.
And that, of course, is a big issue. And you know, the military and its relationship to this administration and to Congress seems to be morphing into something different than what we've put up with in the last many decades. And what I'm thinking about is how many generals are involved.
Yeah.
And some people say, well, the generals that we worry about being very aggressive, and we should, are actually seen right now is trying to calm the president down, because the president tends to speak off the cuff and rather gruff and says things that are, you know, are very confrontational and has significance for world diplomacy. And the generals are supposed to be there now not to urge him on. It's almost at times when they're saying, hey, you know, back off. You know, it was said that the generals tried to calm him down a little bit about going after Iran and stopping that, you know, reversing that agreement. So it is interesting, but still, I'm not comfortable with that much military involvement in the executive branch, because we know how much they're involved as lobbyists in the military-industrial complex. They run the show, you know, and the spending is there and it continues. So the military is a big factor, but it looks to me like because of the president's style, he sort of puts a monkey wrench in this, and nobody knows where they're coming from. And in some ways, people have argued. We've heard some libertarians argue, well, he's just in there stirring the pot, and that's good. But it's also dangerous, and I'd like to philosophically stir the pot so that we can think about the alternatives, because I think this pot is going to boil over, and we'll have to have something else. And that's why, for the years, I've emphasized spending, debt, Federal Reserve, monetizing debt, the foreign policy, and everything that we talk about, because we will get to this point where it's not going to be solved by these people in Washington. I mean, and a grandstand announcement that I can't stand. In a way, I can't stand this president. I'm getting out of here because he's so rude to everybody. That's not going to work either. So I still think the solution has to come when we concentrate and explain what we believe in. You know, I frequently use the term, we're all Keynesians now, which Nixon said, but the better term is we're all interventionists now, and that's essentially what Washington is run by, you know, militarily, foreign policy, monetary policy, the whole works. And of course, when intervention fails, because the empire will fail, and I think that's what this is symbolic of, then we better have our plans laid out on what kind of a system do we want. What should the role of government be? We have to ask some of the fundamental questions that the founders asked, you know, many, many years ago, which we generally have ignored.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the problem with, you talk about the generals, the problem with the generals being so involved is not because they want war first. That's not really the issue. That's, as you point out, they've in many ways they've been a moderating force on Trump's impulses. But I think the objection to the generals being so involved in so many sectors, particularly of foreign policy and homeland security, is because their career, by the nature of their career, they have limited perspective. They've come up learning how to fight and win wars. That's not doesn't necessarily serve you well when you're looking at the broader issues of foreign policy. But the one thing about, I hate to bring up numbers, but the one thing about Flake's speech, and as we pointed out, not much we disagree with it in terms of tone, but I think it's also the product of the changing tone, the changing perspectives of the American voter. And this really is the core of the Trump phenomenon. Despite the positions he's taken that we disagree with, he understood very well the frustration of the American voter with the status quo, the frustration with the foreign policy that hasn't been going regardless of who was in power, and he tapped into that very well. And I think that may be what someone like Kelly Ward is doing, regardless of her positions. He's tapping into the frustration, and that's why he's got 18% job approval rate, 62% of the voters disapprove of him, and in the third quarter he raised $1.1 million to Kelly Ward's $700,000, which that's pretty close to closing the gap. And he had a lot of high-powered people coming to help him raise money.
Yeah, well, I think Trump tapped into it, and that's part of what's going on now. And you talk about the people, the way they're resentful of Washington. But I think most people are concerned about economic policy, basically. Yeah, there's a lot of people that are on the dole and all that mess. But basically, I think the instinct is, you give me a good job and I'll work and I'll be a happy person. But I think it is the division of wealth in this country now. The wealthy are getting wealthier, the poor are getting poorer. Half the people are struggling to make a living. Their standard of living is going down. The cost of living goes up more than the government says. Their real wages do not go up, which is a consequence of monetary policy and spending policy. That's really where the problem is. And Trump and others tap into this, and because the people are unhappy. And I understand that, and I think that's fine to tap in to where the problem is. But what I'm interested in is, how did these problems come about? Why is half of the people getting poorer right now? And they don't talk about interventionism in economics and the Federal Reserve and debt and monetizing debt and too many regulations. They do talk about the regulations and taxes, but it's more than that. They can't tinker with the tax code and reduce the number of pages, which they never do. You know, oh, we're going to reduce the tax code. No, it has to do with a philosophic economic system that we've been putting up with since the Depression, and it keeps getting worse, and it's coming to an end, and the people are very angry and upset, but I think they're spinning their wheels when we look at this superficially, because it goes into everything. You know, this whole thing of the problem and the anger over the election, and it turned out that Hillary, I understand, lost that election, and probably lost it on her own, but it was the Russians' fault.
Oh, yeah.
And so even the Republicans were happy with having, well, you know, we have to make sure the Russians didn't influence the election, so we're good citizens. So they get a special prosecutor. Now they can't trust, and now they're coming up with evidence that Hillary might have been more involved with the Russians than Trump was, and so they're out there doing that now. And I think really the hilarious thing now, and people who want this don't think it's hilarious, but you know, they get Mueller up as a special prosecutor, and maybe he isn't a saint, and it looks like he might have some biases, but now they're saying, well, this stuff is turning up. Of course, it should have been noticed a while ago. It's turning up that Hillary might be involved with corruption. So they want another special prosecutor. So they want a special prosecutor to check on the other special prosecutor to make sure he's doing his job, essentially what they're saying. So that to me gets so silly, you know, about what's going on. Then who's going to check on the next prosecutor, you know? We'll order up another one.
It reminds you of a Nikolai Gogol play or something. But you know, the real issues, as we've said over and over, have been ignored. You know, the Democrats want to say it was the Russians and the white supremacists that got Trump elected. The mainline Republicans are happy blaming it on the Russians because they've had this attitude that you've got to have a bad guy overseas, because also it fuels the military-industrial complex. So everyone is served by it except the issue of the actual politics, or the actual policies, the actual philosophical guidelines that we follow, and they've both given that up. And that's one of the reasons, a big struggle on the left is the fact that there's a huge faction on the left that are so obsessed with fighting Trump on the Russia thing that they're not interested at all in a broad coalition against war. We talked about it yesterday. Right. They're not interested in talking to us because obviously we're not in favor of the other things, so we must be the red-brown coalition or fascists or what have you. So this is the real trouble, and very few are paying attention to it.
And of course, it's well known, the first casualty of war is truth, and the bigger the government is, the larger the empire, the greater is the attack on telling the truth, and truth can actually become treasonous. So the person who reveals what's going on as a whistleblower, they're in bigger trouble than the people who are breaking the law and doing the killing and all the illegal things. And so much of that is going on now too. And as bad as it is, as many lies as that we hear, there's a shift in that, and I think that's part of this frustration we talked about. The people are upset and they want changes because they want the truth, and they don't believe the government. They don't believe these commissions. They look into things, and the commission is supposed to finally settle it and tell us what really went on. But there's no reason to have faith and confidence in that. That we're going to hear the truth, and that's what I thought was the case in Washington. Briefings. I figured they're not going to reveal to us the exact truth.
Well, what the pull quote from Senator Flake's speech is, "Silence can equal complicity." And that is a great line. Of course, the mainstream media views that as the best anti-Trump line ever. But I think we can adopt that as our motto, too. And that's why we refuse to be silent. We refuse to be complicit in what Washington is doing. And we're outside the gates, pounding on them for what they're doing. But I do, on that same line, I would like to remind our viewers that we are still, through the month of October, offering Dr. Paul's latest book, The Revolution at 10 Years, 10 years of the Ron Paul Revolution, as a special gift to those who make a donation, a tax-deductible donation to the Ron Paul Institute. And Dr. Paul, we had a new couple of boxes of books. We had such a big response that we ran out of books. I had to send out emails to everyone saying it's going to be a little bit of a delay. We ran out of books, huge response. We got a couple boxes today, so I'm happy to say we're going to be able to send those out tomorrow.
That's good, because you could be in trouble if we run out of books. That's your job. Make sure we have them.
I know.
But I do want to thank everybody for tuning in today for the Liberty Report. And I think it is a very important subject to understand what's happening, who to blame, and who's at fault. But to be bombastic and accusatory is not the way it's done. I think disagreeing with an attempt to not be disagreeable, I think, is a pretty good rule. And sticking with a principle and trying to convey to others to change their minds. I know some people will never change their minds, but I still think attitude is good. I think you win over more with that type of an approach rather than trying to be more outspoken than the other person and more accusatory. But that's what's going on in Washington, and that's why, in spite of my argument that there's a lot of bipartisanship up there on the issues, there's a lot of partisanship now fighting over the crumbs that are being left. But it also is an opportunity for us to present the case for peace and liberty, and that is what we're supposed to be doing here, and that we try to do every single day, is to reveal the best possible revelation of the truth and what's going on in this country, whether it's foreign policy, economic policy, or the politics of Washington. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.